Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next episode of the Nutrition Hero podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Watts, and today I have a special guest with me, Mr. Mark Newman. I appreciate you being here, sir. Mark Newman from Precision Analytical. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so you, sir, are the creator of one of my favorite technologies in the functional medicine world, and so I got to say, first of all, thank you, and secondly, I got to dig in and start asking, how in the world did you come up with the Dutch test, and how many years in the making was that?
It's a funny thing. It's kind of the culmination of my entire vocational sort of path. I started off as a kid out of school doing urine testing and hormones, which was interesting. But there was some information I liked from it. The patients hated it because they got the urine jug experience, of carrying the jug around all day. And then I started doing a lot of saliva testing and looking at the benefits there. So I've given up all these fun metabolites that we can look at in urine, which are really interesting and helpful clinically. But I've gained this cortisol pattern throughout the day, the free cortisol pattern, which is a huge piece of information that we need for the HPA axis. And then, gosh, it's been maybe a little over 10 years now, started putting together like what can we do that's maybe a better model for people to just, my whole thing, like our test is really easy, but my whole like focus has been on data because I'm I'm cynical. So when I only see like one data point that has a conclusion, I'm thinking like, I want some confirmation for that. But it also ended up being really simple for people to use. So it just kind of fell together that way in terms of the ease. But the main point of the Dutch test, so dried urine test for comprehensive hormones, the Dutch test, was to get all of this information in one model of testing so that we can look at that up and down cortisol pattern throughout the day, but yet still look at how is a person producing and metabolizing cortisol, estrogen, androgen, progesterone, all of those things. And then, so we commercialized that about 5 years ago. And then we just started digging into like, okay, what's next? So we added melatonin because if you've got cortisol, we'd love to see the melatonin. And then we added the oxidative stress marker, 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. And then we recently added some organic acids. So we've got a B6 marker, B12 marker, glutathione marker, some neurotransmitter metabolite. So that's what it's become, and I really love it as a model of testing. I mean, there are different scenarios where different tests work well. For me, it's been by far the best catch-all to just say in most situations, this is going to give you a ton of value for just digging in and trying to figure out what the heck is going on, with a particular case.
Absolutely. I think just to touch on something you said there, one of the things I appreciate the most about the technology behind the Dutch test and what you guys actually do with this information is the data and being able to string all of this together so you can see trends. You're constantly checking and rechecking, making sure that your lab ranges are appropriate, and just the backup that's there, I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. No, that there are a lot of layers to this, and that's what I've loved digging into over the years. There's the analytical layer of, what type of instrument do we use, and we could talk about that for 10 minutes, but you'd probably edit it out because it'd be boring. But it's really important, right, to make sure that we have accurate values. So we use different types of technology for different parts of the test. And then there's the clinical layer of it, of what in the world does this mean in a positive sense? And then for me too, digging into the little caveats of, when is this actually misleading information because of some, how they're taking their supplement or, some different caveat there to make sure that we're giving people the best analytical data, but then also that they're drawing the best conclusions that they can, from the data that they've got.
So specifically from a clinical perspective, you guys are really sharp. Your education is phenomenal that you deliver online. And one of the things that I appreciate is not that you can only find, cool answers to problems, but the testing allows you to ask better questions. And one of those questions is surrounding your cortisol mechanism or the measurement tool that you use. Typically with a saliva test, you would start high during the day, when you trickle down throughout the day, as everybody's familiar with. But one of the things that I think is so cool with your test is being able to measure the rise at the front end of the day. Can you explain that and a little bit about why that is? Where is it applicable? Why is it helpful?
Yeah, well, what we really want to look at there, we want to look at the pattern throughout the day, right? As soon as you wake up, the light hits the back of your eye, and that really complicated process begins in the brain of initiating all this cortisol production. So it creeps up from about 2 a.m. and then as soon as the light triggers that, boom, it bounces up. And so we want to see that surge of cortisol in the morning and then watch it fall throughout the day. So what's unique about the urine test is that waking sample is not a look at your waking cortisol, it's waking urine, which tells you the sort of while you are sleeping cortisol. So you get to see the cortisol that you're making during the night, which is interesting in some of the insomnia cases. And then to look at the melatonin as well. But then we want to see how robust is that lift in the morning. And not to detour the conversation, but that's also why we developed the Dutch Plus, because that window is a 2-hour window. But if you zoom in even closer and look at a waking saliva sample, and then 30 minutes later, that dynamic change within those 30 minutes in saliva is a unique independent variable that adds just one more variable onto what we do with our Dutch Complete, which is the all urine test. So you get the up and down pattern, but you can look in even a little bit closer with the Dutch Plus. Again, not to detour into that because that gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, cortisol is a complex thing, right? There's a lot going on. There's the up and down pattern. There's the metabolism, how fast you're clearing out your cortisol. There's the balance between the active form and the inactive form. There's a lot going on there. And then, of course, there's the whole what's going on at the receptor level, which we don't have a window into that, right? So it's, we want providers, and that's why the education piece becomes so big, is that here's all this information, and then let us help you, chew through it and figure out, what does this mean? And then, of course, what the heck do I do, with it in terms of, from the clinical side.
So you mentioned insomnia there. What would be a typical pattern that you would see with the cortisol rise that happens in the morning with an insomnia patient?
If it's kicking up early, which could be a blood sugar thing, or it can be different causes. But if it's lifting early before you want to wake up, then that's obviously going to be counterproductive to your melatonin production and just counterproductive to the act of sleeping. And so what we typically see is that in a waking urine sample, it's going to be a little bit elevated. We're actually taking the Dutch Plus in a different direction to where we can add one extra sample in there so that you can take a saliva sample the second you wake up. So if you wake up at 1 a.m., that if you take a saliva in the first 5 minutes, like that's a look at your cortisol, like that is waking you up theoretically. So if it's elevated, there's your culprit. So we tested all our employees on this, right? And we got like 50 people, and 2 of them came out really high during the middle of the night. Like that is something worth chasing down. Like what's going on there, and how can we restore that normal pattern? So we've got a couple different ways to look at the while you're sleeping cortisol picture with either the Dutch Plus or the Dutch Complete. And if you have insomnia, that can be it's really important, because if you go treating the high cortisol and that's not the cause, then you're not going to succeed, right? So, just figuring out what's going on is really critical.
I think that's cool, because in your educational videos, you guys talk a lot about that. But one of the other things you talk about is hormone sequestering. And can you get into that a little bit about kind of the dials that your Dutch test has on it and all that kind of stuff with hormone sequestering?
Yeah. As it relates to cortisol, it's really interesting. That is actually the single variable that led me to develop the Dutch test, because I took all this saliva data, like millions of data points, and said, as we had clients that were making this very strong correlation between salivary cortisol and weight gain, because we all know there's a general cortisol weight thing, right? Turn on your radio, you hear a commercial about, let's kill your cortisol production and you'll get skinny, right? But when you look at the data, and it's already in the literature, but when you look at the data, there is no positive correlation between free cortisol and weight gain. It's all in the metabolites, right? So the metabolites are the end result, right? That's the bucket at the end of the day that is just, here's how much cortisol you made. Free cortisol is the circulating cortisol. So what happens is the fat sequesters the cortisol. So you've got this fat sequestering organ essentially sitting around your belly or wherever, but particularly the belly fat, and it grabs the hormone, right? You actually have, I think it's 10 times more DHEA in your fat than in your circulation. right? So fat's pretty good at taking hormones out of circulation. Cortisol happens to be a little bit more water soluble than the rest of those, so it's able to escape, get metabolized, and it ends up in the urine as a metabolite. So you've pulled it out, right? So then your adrenal glands got to make up for that, right? So it makes more and makes more and makes more. You don't feel it, you don't see it in your brain or in your elbow or wherever cortisol's getting, right? But it ends up in your urine as a metabolite. So to get a window into that picture of what is my free cortisol at different points of time, and then a separate question of, okay, how much cortisol am I actually making? You have to look at free cortisol and the metabolites. And when you look at them both, and that's why we present, for those that are familiar with our reports, it's sort of like a speedometer style reporting. So if my free cortisol is at 20 miles an hour and my metabolites are at 100 miles an hour, then I know I've got increased cortisol clearance, which you see very commonly, and it's played out in the literature as well. You see that in obesity, and that's where it gets complicated, because you also would see that in a hyperthyroid case. So if you have a skinny patient that's overdosed on thyroid, you're going to get this look. And if you have an obese patient that isn't hyperthyroid, you get the same look. And so that's where the education piece becomes important, of starting to understand of what leads to these different patterns of the cortisol pattern, the cortisol clearance. And when we start digging into that stuff, you find that I think it just, what I always tell people is, if you use this test instead of a simpler test, you're going to run in the wrong direction a lot less often. Because when you only look at half of the story and you confidently draw a conclusion and you go clinically and you're wrong, then you can really have some negative outcomes. And so that's where I think people have really found greater success in using this more comprehensive testing, and sometimes slowing the clinical intervention, and really taking a more careful approach there, and having better outcomes.
I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that you guys do very well is showing the two different layers of the picture, rather than just, well, it looks like they have low cortisol throughout the day. And you're treating somebody as if, they're on their way towards adrenal hypofunction, when in actuality, they're just clearing it very quickly and their adrenal glands are, quote unquote, fine. I think that the distinction between those two things is a very, very large step in the right direction from a functional perspective. One of the things that you had mentioned previously, as I've seen, is how many patients have we treated over the last 25 years for adrenal hypofunction that maybe didn't really have it, just because of the testing was limited where we were.
Right. And, the thing is, there's really a strong desire, and I understand it, to have kind of paint by number, like clinical thing, where you just say, if it looks like this, we call that stage 1, whatever. Right. We don't say adrenal fatigue anymore, because it's not a very good description of what's actually going on. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And then you get this if-then statement of, if it's this, treat this way. If it's that, treat that way. You have 3 options, and anyone can understand that, and away you go. The problem is, like 30% of the time, you're wrong. And the thing is, you're not just slightly askew in some of these cases, you're entirely misrepresenting what's going on by that conclusion. And when you treat aggressively in light of that, you can get some really negative outcomes for the patient. So it's like it's a 3-dimensional picture that we've been treating as a 2-dimensional picture, and you can just be dramatically and profoundly off in terms of what's going on.
And 30% is not a small number when you're talking about actual people, right? It's not a small number.
Right.
So, all right. Well, with the metabolism of other hormones, let's say estrogen, like estradiol, estriol, et cetera, your perspective on the reporting, I appreciate. I've done a podcast about the report previously, and it's staggering the detail that you can pull out of there with the different percentages and the different pathways, whether it be a 2,4 hydroxy pathway that you're funding, whatever. I think it's phenomenal. With that in mind, when we talk about patients that are funding, maybe the middle hydroxy pathway, the one that you don't want, forming hormones, et cetera. Do you guys have any stats on this? Like, how many people have a predilection towards driving their hormones down that pathway?
I mean, honestly, the reference range itself is by definition educated in that way if you know what we're doing, which you don't. So yeah, the reference range for those is generally like a 20th to 80th percentile for females, kind of split. So if you look at what we're calling normal, that's obviously where normal people tend to fall. And yeah, we can break that down in terms of what that looks like. So we represented as sort of this three-way ratio, saying, look, there are three doors that your estrogen can open: door 1, door 2, door 3. And door 1 is that 2-hydroxy pathway that we're all hoping is favored. And it gets a little bit complex with some of the different patterns that you can see, but generally, if the 4-hydroxy is preferred, that is not something we want to see, because it has that carcinogenic potential, because it can literally take a piece of your DNA and rip it off. And as you're repairing that, that's where the carcinogenic potential comes from. So yeah, we want to see people with a healthy balance, because you don't want to overdo it either, right? Because and this is where you get into some of these multi-layers of, 2-hydroxylation is really good for your estrogens. But guess what happens when polyaromatic hydrocarbons go down the 2-hydroxy pathway? They become more toxic, right? So if you take a woman who doesn't need something done to her estrogen metabolism, and you put her on something like DIM, and you say, look, we put everyone on DIM because it's just what we do, and you end up ramping up this process that is potentially already working very well, you may have a consequence in something else that doesn't really want to be going down that 2-hydroxy pathway in terms of reducing risk. So that's why I think the testing can be really important, because you can have, some surprises in terms of what's going on and what's really driving, this person's estrogen. Yes, she's estrogen dominant. Yes, her estradiol is high, but is she making too much? Is there a phase 1 clearance issue here that we can see? Is there a phase 2 or methylation issue that we can see? And then, if you want to dig further, you can go explore, not with us, but you can go explore genetic components to that to see. Like for me, I have a COMT defect.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up.
Yeah, I have 2 of them, right? And my methylation of my estrogens stinks every time I test myself. And I've been, doing some different things to try to impact that. And the genetics were actually helpful for me in that sense, because I know I have a COMT issue, means my enzyme doesn't work very well. That's entirely different than someone who has an MTHFR issue, which means they don't make methyl donors. So my first response was really stupid. I went and took a bunch of methyl donors, and I got wired, and I felt terrible. And then I was thinking through this with someone, and they said, well, you're actually not very intelligent, because if you don't have a methyl donor deficiency, you're unable to use them. So now by giving methyl donors, I've increased my epinephrine production, but I still can't get rid of this stuff. And so it made sense why I felt the way I did when I combined the hormone testing with the genetics, which again, that's not something we do. But when you mentally put the two together, it creates an interesting story that you can tell that can be really helpful.
Exactly. And I think that story is the key to why your testing is so helpful, because it gives you background information that you're not going to find anywhere else. It's literally, I think, going to change the landscape of healthcare, if it's not already. It's pretty awesome. There's a situation that I want to talk about with progesterone and being able to measure progesterone in the urine. What are you guys doing with that specifically?
So progesterone in its simplest form for us is just a simple story of how much did you make today. When we look at serum progesterone and we correlate it to our test, we get a strong correlation, but we don't actually measure progesterone. So I think you can give the details fairly quickly. In urine, you don't have a hormone. You have a conjugated form of that hormone, right? I don't have any estradiol. I have estradiol glucuronide. That's a conjugated water-soluble form. It's a good reflection of bioavailable hormone. Those conjugation steps happen on hydroxy groups. Progesterone has no hydroxy group, so there's none in urine, basically. So it gets turned into these other compounds called pregnadiol. That ends up in the urine, and that's what's always been traditionally used as a surrogate marker for progesterone, so that's what we measure. The benefit of measuring it in urine, like serum's a fine test for progesterone for the most part, but when you look at people who have tested like dozens of times over the day, which of course nobody would do except for a study. But when they've done that, I mean, they actually show women who move from less than 5 to greater than 30 within the course of a day. Like that's going to be really confusing. And, generally speaking, people don't tend to bounce around that much, but some of them, it's really volatile. So when you look at a urine test, so for us, it represents about half of your day, which just averages out all these highs and lows and gives you a good reflection of progesterone production. So that's where it starts. Progesterone goes down two pathways. We grab the major metabolite from both pathways, and those correlate to serum progesterone. And then we're able to actually add those up in a proprietary way that gives you what we call a progesterone serum equivalent, which tells you about what your serum value likely would be on that day. And that's how we use that. Though that's pretty simple. Then where it gets a little bit more complicated is for your patients that are on oral progesterone. There's a little bit more to that. So with oral, when I give progesterone vaginally, I'm trying to give progesterone. If I take it sublingually, I'm trying to give progesterone. When I take it orally, it's actually acting more like a prohormone, right? It really helps a patient sleep, but why? It's not the progesterone, or you could give it any other way. It's all the allopregnanolone that your gut turns it into. So I take progesterone, and only 5 or 10% of it escapes as progesterone. A lot of it gets turned into allopregnanolone, which it just so happens has some nice sedating effects and helps women sleep. So oral progesterone, is taken for those purposes. Well, allo is alpha. That's the alpha pathway. Allo or alpha pregnanolone, that's a pathway. There are two primary pathways, and so we have both of them represented. So when a woman really pushes her progesterone down that alpha pathway, she's going to get more of a clinical effect, right? But you don't want to overdo it, right? Mm-hmm. So if a woman's not sleeping, she's on oral progesterone, then I'm going to ask myself, well, which way is she pushing it? If she pushes it the other pathway, I might say, hey, you might want to take a little bit more, because you're like, I'm like that. I'm a beta metabolizer, which pushes down the non-sleepy pathway, essentially, right? Not as much. So I might want to take a little bit more. Whereas if the woman's really pushing down that sort of sleepy pathway and she's not sleeping, don't give her more, right? Go bark up a different tree. Go look at melatonin. Go look at cortisol. You want to look at, so we want to be a little bit more intelligent about how we're able to evaluate what's going on with oral progesterone, which is really key, because oral progesterone, you cannot monitor with serum or saliva testing, because you take it at bedtime. It goes up and then down within a couple of hours, and you go measure when you wake up in the morning. There's really nothing there left to measure, right? So that's not a good tool in those cases. So yeah, so the progesterone, it's about getting baseline values that parallel serum, and then it's about really effectively looking at what's going on with the oral progesterone.
That's awesome. I like that you went there, by the way. When we look at patients that have polycystic ovarian syndrome, or patients that are on birth control, people that are on metformin and birth control, and it starts to get convoluted when we talk about this stuff, I think that your testing provides a layer of interpretation that you're not going to find any other place, in that it gives your patients options, because you're looking at the multiple pathways for each of these hormones that they're taking. What has been your experience up to this point with patients that have PCOS, and what are you got, because it's a syndrome, my question is what are you developing on down the road? Where do you see PCOS treatment going for patients?
Well, keeping in mind, I'm a chemist, not a clinician, yep. So the treatment side is not my area of expertise. But from a testing standpoint, it's the insulin's usually at the heart of that, right? So the insulin is driving a couple of things. It tends to drive DHEA production, right? So we've got three major markers for DHEA. Those are the three like buckets at the end of the day that your DHEA ends up in. So looking at those gives us an idea of whether that's pushing too much. Right. Then we can look at testosterone. Right. So if you have too much testosterone, that's going to be another issue, which is coming probably half of it from the DHEA, and then some from the ovaries. So we want to look at that DHEA, testosterone. But the other issue that the insulin pushes is it pushes 5-alpha metabolism. So progesterone's the same way as the androgens. It's got two pathways. It's got an alpha pathway and a beta pathway. And like with progesterone, the alpha pathway is more active. Well, with the androgens, it's the same thing. So when testosterone goes down that alpha pathway, it becomes DHT, which is 3 times as potent. So that pathway is pushed by insulin. So in a PCOS woman, you can get 3 different things. You can get too much DHEA, you can get too much testosterone, or you can get this, call it androgenic metabolism, this 5-alpha metabolism. So if you have all three, if you got the trifecta, like you're probably going to have a lot of symptoms associated with high androgens. But if you have one or two and not all three, you can treat them a little bit differently, right? You can, sometimes women will take saw palmetto, which is normally thought of as,
Right.
an older guy trying to treat his prostate, but all it's doing is it's an herbal approach to blocking DHT production. So if a woman is really making too much DHT and it's causing her to, let's say, lose her scalp hair,
Right.
then that might be an intervention that's worth thinking about. But, low thyroid can lead to scalp hair loss. And do you want to take your hypothyroid patients and needlessly put them on a 5-alpha blocking herbal concoction? Like, no. And that's where the testing can be helpful to see which of these variables is driving this this particular symptom for you. And with PCOS, those are all important, but of course progesterone is going to be important, and then the estrogen as well, to try to get an overall look at what's going on with the hormones.
Yeah, that's really cool. And as a clinician, I appreciate the chemist perspective. so, so that's cool. When we look at your testing, what do you guys have in the works? What are you projecting here? You're expanding into organic acids, which I think is phenomenal. That is a very useful tool for a clinician. Being able to put those two things together with some of the other stuff that you guys already do, like with your Dutch Plus, I mean, it's pretty cool. So give us a little taste of what's coming down the road in the testing world here.
We're working on a couple things I can't talk about yet, but part of it will be potentially expanding the organic acids. I mean, we started 5 years ago. We've got this Dutch model of testing. We tried to make the pricing as aggressive as we could, but then we've got some really top-notch chemists, so we're able to make it really efficient. So as we've added efficiencies with just economies of scale and all of that, what we've done is we've reinvested that in the test. So we added the melatonin, we added the 8-hydroxy, we added the organic acids. And I feel like that cup's pretty full right now. Intellectually, it's a lot to wrestle through. It's a lot of information, and our lab is busy with all kinds of instruments, trying to get all kinds of numbers. So we're working on potentially an expanded panel that would be just kind of another step up, which might include some expanded organic acids. Right? There's a folate marker. There's some markers that might give you a little indication of what's going on in the gut. Organic acids are interesting because about half of what people test, and this is just an opinion from a guy who's developed organic acid testing in the past, but just one guy's opinion is, the literature support for some of the conclusions that are drawn in that line of testing is pretty thin for some things. Like, there's a marker for CoQ10, just as a random example. It's 14 metabolic steps ahead of CoQ10, and we say, well, hey, if this is high, you must be low in CoQ10. Like, there's not a lot of literature support for that. It sort of makes sense. And so we sort of run with that. Citric acid cycle intermediates, they're interesting to some people, but the literature support for what they mean when they deviate a little bit is a little bit challenging. But then there are a handful of markers, some of which we've added, that have really nice support for them. If methylmalonic acid's high, you probably have a B12 deficiency. If xanthuric acid's high, you probably have a B6 deficiency. And so that's why we added those to our profile. There are a bunch of other ones that you can go fishing for that are really interesting and add into the picture, but they also make you scratch your head a little bit more. So we want to be pretty targeted in where we add those. And so that'll probably be an expanded panel that we'll look at down the road. And then we've got a couple other markers that I'm super excited about that, I don't know, 6 or 9 months from now, we'll hopefully be ready to start talking about this, to give a little bit more information. But it all folds into the same story that we're trying to tell. It's just all about figuring out which variables matter, and then going to find them in that sample. So
that's awesome, Mark. I appreciate you being on the podcast today. You're a good guest. You got into enough detail that it was good stuff, man.
Yeah, hopefully we don't nerd out too much. We lose too many people, but
no.
We love chatting hormones. So happy to be here and happy to do it anytime.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. If you're just tuning in here, you've been listening to Mark Newman at a Precision Analytical talk about Dutch testing and all of the stuff surrounding it. We appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.